After the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese become involved in World War I. That began in 1914, and we're going to look at some of the things that are happening in Japan during this period from 1914, when World War I began, all the way through 1945, when World War II ended. So during this long 30-year span, we want to look at some things that were happening within Japan. I do want to review some of the things that happened up to this point. So we're going to look at the Russo-Japanese War very briefly, and then we're going to talk about this notion of modernity. What does it mean to become modern? All right. Then we will just very briefly touch on the Great War. The Paris Peace Conference and the League of Nations is what concerns us the most, and that's where the source comes in, illusions of the white race. And then we will look at some examples of Japan's ultra-nationalism following the Paris Peace Conference. You remember the Russo-Japanese War, this political cartoon of the Japanese emperor on the left, U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt in the middle, and Tsar Nicholas II on the right, representing Russia. So, Japanese won, and this is a significant event. Remember that as a result of this war, the Russians have to recognize that the Japanese have a claim on Korea. The Russians have to get out of Manchuria. They have to relinquish their control of Port Arthur. So it's a big win for the Chinese too, but for the Japanese it's a big win. So how did Japan's development after 1800 compare with China's? And we've talked about this some before, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page. The Chinese believed that they were the middle kingdom, that they were at the center of the world, and that they were superior to others. And that was a long cultural, philosophical, religious tradition within China. But the Chinese lose to the British in the First Opium War. The Chinese lose to the Japanese in the First Sino-Japanese War. And this begins to put China in a predicament. We're not the best. We've lost to a Western power and we've lost to an Asian power. So what does this mean? And the Chinese, the government, the Qing government, did try to make changes to modernize a little bit, but it was too little too late. And then we see a nationalist revolution in 1911, leading to Sun Yat-sen in 1912. Japan did not follow China's example. Japan decided to modernize much sooner in the 1800s. After the Americans arrived, the Japanese had what's called the Meiji Restoration. And so the Japanese, they began to modernize more quickly, and this is where we come to this term, modernity. And this is where I say becoming modern. So what did modernity mean in the early 1900s? There are five examples that I'm going to draw from, and I'm going to go through these really quickly. So just pause the video if you need to see all of them, okay? But there are 5 different categories. So you have, how can you define modernity? You can define it politically, economically, technologically, militarily, and culturally. And so politically, we see this in Japan, where they create a constitution that has some representative government that's supposed to protect individual rights and lead to greater equality. Okay, so the Meiji Constitution fits that part of the definition. Economically, they're supposed to open access to markets and have free flow of capital. This is really a capitalist principle, and the Japanese want to do that as well. Technologically, this is the Industrial Revolution right here, advances in transportation and communication. Militarily, a professional standing army and navy. The Japanese began to do that. Remember that they borrowed a lot when they created their constitution. They borrowed from the Prussians, the German government, and so they also are learning from the Prussians with their military professionalism. And then culturally, we're talking about nationalism here, unified national identity. Okay, so that's modernity. And Um, I think it's safe to say that the Russo-Japanese War was an example, a very strong example that the Japanese had modernized and were going to continue to modernize. They're not following the Western example strictly by the letter, but they are making changes while trying to keep some of their heritage intact. For example, the Japanese still had an emperor, and the people of Japan were still subjects, not citizens. So there were differences. But more or less, the Japanese modernized, and the Russo-Japanese War, the victory there, shows that their modernization worked. Now, the Great War takes place from 1914 to 1919. All the green countries here sided with the Allies, and all of the yellow powers were with the central. All the yellow countries are with the central powers. So you can see Germany right here. Germany's here with Austria-Hungary, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and some of their colonies in Africa. But that's pretty much it. Most of the world sided with Great Britain, the United States, France. And you can see China. China sided with the Allies, so did Japan. They're all on the same team. At the moment, they're all on the same team. Now, I showed this before. The Japanese send a delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. Wars are not technically over until there's a treaty, and so the treaty is signed in France, and a lot of the negotiations take place in Paris. That's why it's called the Paris Peace Conference. And so here's the Japanese delegation, and you might remember the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson was there. He talked a lot about self-determination. Okay, this idea that nations should be allowed to govern themselves without meddling from other countries, so long as they follow certain principles of equality, equal rights and equal opportunities. So long as nations do that, they should have the right of self-determination. They should be free to govern themselves. And in a European context, this happens. The Allies decide to make all of these nations their own nations, all the way from Finland down to Yugoslavia. So you do start to see self-determination taking place in these parts of Eastern Europe. Where you do not see self-determination taking place is in Asia. It doesn't take place in Africa either, but it does not take place in Asia. So self-determination was not for everyone. It was only for a few, even though Wilson made it sound like it was for everyone, and a lot of people were very excited about. A lot of people in Japan were excited about this idea of self-determination. We see this example here most prominently with Shandong province in China. So remember, when we looked at this part of Chinese history, Shandong was controlled by the Germans. The Chinese want it back. It's where Confucius was supposedly born, where he was from. So the Chinese want Shandong back, and it doesn't happen. This is part of the Paris Peace Conference, part of the treaty. This is from Article 156, and it says that Germany gives up all of its territories that it has here in Jiaozhou, but it gives them to Japan. It does not give them back to China. So the Chinese are angry. The Chinese, you remember from when we looked before, the Chinese, this leads to the May 4th movement, where you had a lot of students who were heavily influenced by communist beliefs. Chen Duxiu was there. And so this leads to a protest movement within China. Now, of course, that doesn't happen in Japan because Japan got Shandong. They wanted Shandong. But another problem takes place that really rankles the Japanese who were there. So Woodrow Wilson is known for self-determination. He's also known for the League of Nations. So we have the United Nations today, but before the United Nations, we had something called the League of Nations. And this was really Wilson's big idea. The League of Nations was supposed to be an organization of countries coming together to try to prevent war from happening. They'd just been through World War I. They want to try to prevent wars from happening in the future. So you have the Paris Peace Conference, and the League of Nations is being established. The Japanese propose a racial equality clause in the League of Nations. And the text is here for you if you want to look at it. I'll move my head so you can see all of it. But the equality of nations being a basic principle of the League of Nations, the high and contracting parties agreed to accord as soon as possible to all alien nationals of states, members of the League, equal and just treatment in every respect, making no distinction either in law or in fact on account of their race or nationality. The Japanese want this racial equality clause put into the League of Nations, and Woodrow Wilson says no, he doesn't want it. So they have a vote, and the vote actually passes. I have the numbers here for you. So 17 countries were there to vote. 11 of the countries voted in favor of having this. 11 of the 17 countries voted in favor of this racial equality clause, but some of the ones who did not vote in favor of it were the United States and Great Britain, and those two countries say, we're not having this. The U.S. and Great Britain shot this down and said, no, we are not having this racial equality clause in the League of Nations. Part of that is, it's obviously disappointing and sad, but it's also understandable because there was not racial equality in the United States. So Wilson knows that this is going to be too controversial to have. Nevertheless, the Japanese are really annoyed because they thought that this would be a good step forward towards racial equality. They were tired of what they viewed as a lot of white supremacy coming out of the West. One of the key figures we study in this period is Okuma Shigenobu, and he is known for this document, Illusions of the White Race. So Okuma was an important figure in the Meiji Restoration. Here in this picture, he's in full military uniform because he had been to the funeral for Emperor Mutsuhito in 1912. So he's a very important figure. And I want you to think about, in this document, what's his main argument? What's he trying to prove? And do you agree with him? Does he believe all races are equal? Does the fact that he was born a nobleman change your perspective of this document or of him? After the Paris Peace Conference, the Japanese begin to undergo this period of ultra-nationalism. So Emperor Mutsuhito died in 1912. Another emperor took his place that created the Taisho period. But then we have the Showa emperor, 1926, 1989. And this is a picture of Hirohito, who ruled for more than 60 years as the emperor of Japan. And so the Japanese, during this period, begin to become more aggressive. They're sick and tired of Western countries doing what they want, and they're having to suffer and not get the things that they want. So I'll run through this real quickly. This is Manchuria. The Japanese want Manchuria badly, but they can't just take it because the League of Nations has said you can't just take territories anymore. That's not what we should do. That causes wars. But the Japanese want Manchuria. It's right here, next to Korea. It also has important railways. This orange line is the one that the Japanese had helped to construct anyway. So they want Manchuria. They concoct a plan where they plant a bomb to go off right here on this orange line, the South Manchurian Railroad. The Japanese plant a bomb to destroy the railroad, and they're going to blame it on the Chinese. The bomb was a horrible disaster. It didn't actually destroy the railway. Here are some League of Nations inspectors looking at the site, and they can't see anything wrong with the railway. Here's another picture supposedly showing a fragment here of the railway that came off. But, I mean, the bomb didn't really work. Nobody believed the Japanese that the Chinese were responsible for this. And so the League of Nations tells Japan, you can't do this. Stop doing this. You are lying to us. Well, the Japanese get angry and they decide they're going to pull out of the League of Nations. And so, anyway, I'm out of time, but I just want to make it clear to everyone that you see this picture here, the League of Nations. Japan pulled out in 1933. So did Germany. So something to think about, ladies and gentlemen. The League of Nations was a horrible failure. We're going to look at the Nanjing Massacre next. So anyway, have a good day, everybody. I'll see you next time.